4. Lyr awoke tied to a wooden pole by his wrist and ankles. His head ached, and his body complained of various hurts. His shoulder was bandaged, and he felt feverish. He knew it to be the sign of an infection. If the infection did not kill him, and nothing inside of his body was aggravated by the moving him so roughly, he might live. Lyr looked around his surroundings. It was late in the afternoon, and he was surrounded by Picts. The short, swarthy men were painted and tattooed with various designs. He had no way to know that he was looking upon a degenerate and backward race of Picts, for he had never encountered the taller and pure-blooded men of the ancient woods. Lyr watched with horror as the Picts dragged one of their own severely wounded to a table. The wounded man fought and screamed at his captors. They cut his throat and held him upside down to bleed him. At first Lyr thought the wounded man was a sacrifice, then learned to his horror that the Picts were more debased than that. They set to cutting at the man's flesh with knives of flint. The strips of flesh they then pierced on wooden skewers and set over a fire to cook. Beside him Lyr saw more Cimmerians. None of them were from his dun or from the surrounding farms. The Picts must have raided far and wide and then come together here to make the return trek home. Most of the captives were young women or children, the ones the Picts did not believe would fight back and could be easily cowed.
"You, bird boy, you awake?"
a Pict snarled as he neared Lyr. Lyr knew a few words of the Picts' guttural tongue. The Cimmerians had made it a point to learn as much as they could about people they shared such enmity with. "You smell like bear scat," Lyr insulted the Pict. Rather than kick or hit him, the Pict laughed. He said to Lyr,
Good. Brave ones like you, they always break upon the standing rock."
The Pict left and returned to the company of his tribe. Lyr watched as he picked up a skewer of human meat and began to feast. Lyr struggled at the bonds, but the leather bindings only bit deeper. There was a fluttering of wings, and around his pole several large ravens landed. The black-winged birds watched him with an eerie intelligence. It was not hard to deduce that the sorcerer of the Picts, who had already demonstrated his unnatural control of the animals of the woods, had sent them to observe Lyr and prevent his escape. Any action on his part, and they would raise their voices to alert the Picts. Lyr felt familiar despair creep into his spirit. The Picts slept the majority of the remaining day. They rotated their watchmen so that they were well rested. Lyr could now see that the gathering was not of one Pictish tribe, but many. He noticed some Picts identified their tribal kin by tattoos, and others by animal body parts worn as totems. He was being held by a group that each wore a black raven feather, either in their hair or upon their person. They paid Lyr no mind. Occasionally one of them would wander over to where the women were held captive and abuse them. The women did not cry out, which made the Picts abuse them more savagely. Lyr held this as another incriminating tally against himself, that he was too weak to free his kin and fellow Cimmerians. Near the fall of dusk, the Picts broke camp and forced their captives to march. Lyr was carried so that his feet would not touch the ground. He had no idea why the Picts did this, carrying him like a slain deer. The captives were led ever westward. The wilderness around them soon lost its familiarity, and the trees grew thicker and more aged. The ground had a gradual slope downward. That Lyr knew meant soon they would be leaving Cimmeria. He knew better than to hope that any rescue would come. Rion had made his opinion of Lyr's place clear when he had tossed him from the hilltop. Each day, Lyr looked for chances to escape, but none came. The rocking gait of the Picts did little to aid his recovery, and soon the leather bindings were causing wounds in his wrists. This caused some debate amongst the Picts about how to transport Lyr. Finally, they decided to create a travois and lash him to it. This made for an even bumpier ride, but it was easier on his back. The Picts continued west for another week. Along the way, they lost 3 men to Cimmerian women who managed to wound their assaulters. The women that dared seek to defend themselves were lashed viciously, and one died of her wounds. Several days later, the Picts brought a halt to their march. They made an encampment surrounding a hill, upon the crown of which carved stone and wooden totems stood proudly against the sky. The Pictish hunting troops were met by Pictish women and children who emerged from the forest. All the Picts possessed the short stature and wary eyes that Lyr had come to associate with their breed. Here they knelt and prostrated themselves before a central wooden idol. They beat their drums and danced in frenzied circles before the totem. A few even gashed themselves with knives and smeared their blood upon the wooden god. Unlike the stones and rotting wooden totems, this pole, twice as thick as a man and 3 times as tall, stood eerily immaculate. At the base of the statue, flowers and thorns both bloomed. Lyr noticed that the wooden skin of the totem showed no weathering nor splitting cracks. Lyr was enraged when the Picts seized a Cimmerian child. a boy no older than 7 years, and marched him to the statue. The Picts bound him to the wooden totem with his chest against the trunk. Then they ripped off his shirt and began whipping his bare back. The boy screamed and writhed, and the Picts shouted with glee. Finally, a Pictish warrior approached the boy and undid his bindings. He marched the boy to a different totem stone and affixed him with his bleeding back against the face of this new menhir. Taking an obsidian knife, the Pict plunged the stone blade into the boy's chest. The boy's heart's blood spurted out, and the Picts yelled in a sickening blood ecstasy. Lyr did not look away. Instead, he resolved to remember which Pict had slain the boy, as he had with every Pict that had abused the women, and promised himself that if he should escape, he would gut each and every one of the men who had abused and slain his kin. But soon Lyr had other concerns, for the Cimmerian child was not to be the only sacrifice. Strong arms lifted Lyr from his travois and kept his feet from touching the ground. He was held aloft by 4 men. They lifted him to the sky. He could now see the blood-soaked features of the wooden idol more clearly. He was shocked to see that the pole was carved to appear like a crow, and in the manner of a Cimmerian totem. He heard snippets of Pictish speech that called to the god's attention. "Jeel, Jeel, the hungry crow, they called. Lyr was held fast as an elderly Pictish man approached the bands of assembled warriors. The man was flanked by a large male bear. The animal lumbered beside the Pict and growled at any that got too near. Lyr could see several raven feathers woven into the man's leather shirt. Here, appearing with none of the grandeur that Lyr had assumed he would possess, was the sorcerer that led the Picts. Lyr laughed. The elderly Pict neared him and scowled. "You think I am weak, boy?" the man asked. "No, but damn, you're an ugly little coward," Lyr said in the best Pictish he could manage. His response was heard by all the Picts that held him and were near him. He had not used the proper grammar, but they understood the meaning of his taunt. "Brave fool," said the elderly Pict. "This post was carved by your kind to appease our ancestors when they defeated them in battle. Now you will feed the hungry crow who calls for your blood." "You mean you stole it after we Cimmerians migrated east? You're nothing but a thief, hiding behind stronger beasts than yourself. Put me down and fight me as a man would, if you be a man and not a wizened shade," Lyr taunted. Again, Lyr's grammar was imprecise, but the meaning was clear. A Pict that held him drew a knife and scratched Lyr's face. The blade cut above his left eye, and blood flowed down to his chin. The Pictish warrior would have slain him, but with a gesture the shaman spared Lyr. "He who calls you must be fed," the shaman purred. "I think he was, as you say, once a Cimmerian dog, but he has grown lonely and twisted in his isolation. He is thoroughly a Pictish warrior now, and he so loves the taste of Cimmerian blood. His favorite hymns are Cimmerian screams, and when we are done with you, we shall make him a kilt of your skin." The elderly shaman motioned for Lyr to be taken to the post. The Picts obeyed him, and Lyr was taken to the wooden totem. They bound him facing the post, as they had the boy before him. Other cultures would have told their men that are facing their doom to pray. Lyr instead, once free of the clutches of his captors, began to writhe in an attempt to cut the bonds by friction or some sharp nick in the wood. He found none. An aged totem made of wood should have possessed barbs and nicks that he could exploit, but instead all that he felt was a smooth surface. Along its surface Lyr could now read the Oyam letters that were filled with metal, so that the surface of the totem remained smooth. The totem was clearly Cimmerian in origin. Lyr wondered if some Pictish sorcery kept the statue from deteriorating. Perhaps it was the fresh human blood. They ripped his shirt open, and Lyr heard the Picts grasp. The scars upon Lyr's back were visible for all to see. He heard muttering amongst the Picts. He gathered that his scars were laced in a pattern that held some meaning to them. The Picts then raised up a fearsome shout, and the shaman silenced them with his raised hands. "The marked man has come. Now you see the wisdom of my instruction. Which warriors were it that complained about my order not to let his feet touch the ground?" the shaman declared, and asked. "It was I," said an older warrior. He prostrated himself before the shaman. "I forgive you, Andalupal," the shaman said with false magnanimity. He continued, "By the wisdom of a shaman can never be questioned. You must pay for your lapse of judgment. What will you give the gods for offending their trust in your shaman?" The warrior strode to the edge of the Pictish circle and hauled his stunted woman to the stones. He lashed her to the stone post, and taking up a whip, he flayed her shoulders. The woman pleaded with him and squealed in pain. Andalupal did not relent. He kept the lashing whip moving until finally the woman ceased her cries. Whether dead or unconscious, Lyr could not tell. He prayed now it was the former, for if she lived, she would never have the full use of her arms again. The warrior handed the whip to the shaman, who seemed pleased. Then he returned to the circle of warriors. Now the shaman began chanting. At moments in the chant, he would crack the whip against Lyr's back. The pain was far greater than the leather strap Lyr had endured from his mother, yet the boy did not cry out in pain until after many blows had been struck. The Pict continued the chanting and the whipping for nearly a quarter hour. By the time he had finished, Lyr's shoulder bones were exposed. Lyr knew now that the Picts would indeed kill him. He ceased to resist and accepted that his death, which should have happened when he had fallen from the rise, had merely been delayed. With what breath he had left, he began singing. It was no hymn nor dirge. It was a nonsense song, sung by Cimmerian women when they were doing their chores. Something in his voice or the song caused the Picts to cease their celebrations. They listened in rapt silence, and Lyr sang his death song. Amongst the captives arose a chorus of voices. Many of the Cimmerian women who had been taken captive had joined the song. The Picts looked about themselves, confused. They could tell that the song had some meaning, but could not discern what it must be. Nervous mutters began amongst the Picts, fearing that the song of lament was some kind of spell. The shaman stabbed Lyr with the sacrificial knife. Lyr was looking into the man's eyes as the weapon pierced his chest. Had Lyr been cognizant, he would have recognized the look of fear in the shaman's eyes. Death did not feel the way that Lyr had been told to expect it. He did not feel cold, nor was the world a never-ending vista of endless gray and mirthless mists. He stood near his slain body. The living people around him appeared as hazy shapes of colored auras, as they had in the dream before when the colors had emanated from the living. The shaman was a swirling mass of dark gray shades and blackened light. Lyr swiped at the man in anger. His hand passed harmlessly through the shaman. Upon the stones where the Cimmerian boy and the Pictish woman had been slain, Lyr saw their shadowy spirits. The spirits wailed as they smoldered like a piece of green wood placed upon a fire. They tried to pry themselves away from the physical stones which held their spirits, yet they remained trapped. Lyr understood that the stones would devour the spirits of those slain upon them. Perhaps this was the source of the shaman's power. Without pausing to consider the consequences, Lyr's ethereal body moved to the stone nearest him, which was that to which the Pictish woman was bound. He tried to pick up a rock or a club, but found he could not grasp any of the objects of the physical world. He battered at the stone with his hands, but they passed through. He experienced a sensation like unto that of his hands being submerged in a cool grease. A flutter of wings filled his ears, and on the tops of the stones a murder of crows began to land. Their raucous cawing filled the air, and Lyr wanted to shut his ears. Instead, he grasped a hold of the Pictish woman, now immersed up to her ethereal waist as the stone absorbed her. There came a great rush of wind. The earth trembled, and Lyr heard a sound like the crashing of great waves upon the shore. Standing now with him in the profaned sanctuary, there stood 3 lovely women. Each appeared in human shape, but was arrayed with strange glory. The first wore a gown made of clouds and mist. The second wore a gown made of grass and leaves. The third wore jewelry made of corals and shells, and seemed wet as if she had emerged from a bath. Each held a spear in their hand, the shafts of which were mounted by shining bluish steel spear points. The shape of these spear points was that which was commonly called a leaf blade. The spears were in the fashion of the spears of Cimmeria. Though outsiders believed Cimmerians to only worship uncaring Crom, this was an error. The Cimmerian pantheon was older than the commonly accepted history of the Hyborian sages. Many of these gods and goddesses were only able to be communicated with in a specific sacred space, and Lyr knew in an instant that what he was witnessing were the goddesses that turned their ears here to these stolen menhirs. He pulled harder upon the limb of the woman the stone was trying to devour. The goddesses looked at each other in amazement at what they witnessed. Here was a son of their kin attempting to save a woman who was of the blood of his foes. Lyr pulled and pulled, yet ever so slowly the stone drank the woman's spirit. Then the goddesses of the place stepped near him, and they too gripped the Pictish woman's spirit. They pulled her from the stone that tried to clutch her. As they pried her free from the corrupted stone, there emerged black, gooey tendrils of something other, clinging to the woman's ghost. With a slice of her spear, one of the goddesses cut the Pict free of their ethereal bonds. Lyr and the woman collapsed upon the sod, and he wondered why, if he could pass through the living men, he did not pass through the unyielding earth beneath him. But there was little time to ponder the metaphysics of the afterlife. He sprung up from the ground and ran to the spirit of the boy. All that remained of the boy's spirit that Lyr could see was the boy's head and a single outstretched arm above the surface of the stone. Lyr grasped the arm and tried to pull the captive free of the horrid stones. Yet this time the goddesses did not aid him. Instead, They gripped his arms and forced him backward. Lyr shouted at them to release him, to aid the sinking child, but one of them turned his cheek to face her. In her eyes he saw only sorrow, and he sensed the divine women believed that it was too late to save the boy. They would not release Lyr. They would not let him sacrifice himself in vain. The boy's face disappeared within the surface of the stone. His ghostly arm remained outside of it, reaching for the air, and for Lyr. The boy's outstretched arm vanished slowly into the stone totem. Something unseen and unclean far below them growled. Lyr heard the sound of great jaws breaking apart bones. Lyr turned his face and shouted in rage at the unfairness of it all. It was horrid enough the way the boy had died, but to be devoured in such a manner and crushed into oblivion. The sight inflamed fires of rage in the deepest part of Lyr's soul, and perhaps it was this just anger combined with the mercy he had shown for a fellow human being, even a foe, that moved the silent goddesses next. The goddess that was decorated in seashells placed her mouth against the wound in Lyr's chest, for his ethereal body copied the wounds he had received in life. There she kissed the wound the obsidian knife had made, and Lyr realized she had also sucked in a portion of his blood. She turned to her ghostly sisters and touched her lips, still red with his life's blood. Some silent communication passed between the trio. Then the goddesses, robed with the earth, approached Lyr. She passed her hand over the cut the Pict had given him over his eye. There was a worried expression upon her face, and Lyr wondered what could give a goddess pause. Then the goddess robed in storm cloud neared him. She walked behind his spirit and looked upon his back. He had the sense that he was being judged, but without knowledge of the expectations. This was not a new sensation to him, and he reverted to the quiet stoicism he had learned as a child. The goddess behind him nodded to the other two phantom women. Then she grabbed a hold of the Cimmerian from behind. Each of the goddesses embraced his soul. Each kissed his lips. Then in unison, the three silent goddesses shoved his spirit back inside his flesh. The last he saw of them that day was of their serene faces longingly to communicate something to him. But he, being mortal, would not be able to understand the message. As the otherworldly scene faded, he watched them disappear, taking the Pictish woman's soul with them to wherever it was the goddesses dwelt. He coughed, and blood poured from his mouth. The Picts who had been celebrating ceased their revels. Lyr looked up, his vision blurry. Those that heard the tale later would say that the shaman's strike had not pierced Lyr's heart. The elderly man must have missed his intended target, and Lyr, having already been greatly abused, had swooned. Surely no man could come back from the dead. That is what men who heard the tale later would tell themselves. Those that were witnesses to the event, Pict and Cimmerian alike, knew differently. The Cimmerian locked gazes with the shaman, whose eyes in Lyr's vision were like two endless pools of black water. The shaman approached and carefully examined Lyr's face, peering intently into his eyes. The Cimmerian's vision was still partially able to glimpse the spiritual truth of his surroundings. In the black pools of the shaman's evil glare, Lyr could see a reflection of himself, and his eyes were no longer his own. A pair of crow-like yellow irises glowed back at the shaman. "They've bewitched me," Lyr thought. "Those goddesses bewitched me." "There was power in you, boy, but now something else dwells inside of you," the shaman said. "Those who fight their way back from the land of the dead are shamans. You are God-touched. Do you understand me?" "Mostly," Lyr replied. "It leaves me in a difficult place. If I declare that I missed this strike, I will bring into question my skill. Yet if I kill you and declare you did die, I break a taboo as old as the Picts. A shaman may not kill nor curse another shaman, save in a duel. How should I resolve this, I wonder?" the shaman asked Lyr. "If you will release the Cimmerians you have taken captive, I will be your servant," spat Lyr. "How would I be able to ever trust you?" the shaman asked. "Because I gave you my word, you shit-eating, braggadocious ass," Lyr snarled. The shaman pondered the proposal. "I cannot let the women go. The men will want them. But I could let the children flee into the wild and take their chances." "And you will not send warriors nor beasts to slay them," Lyr said. The shaman thought of it. "Very well. It will raise my standing greatly to have a Cimmerian shaman as a slave. If you disobey me or attempt to betray me in any way, the animals of the wood will tell me. The punishment I will mete out will not be upon you, but upon the Cimmerian women. Are we in agreement?" Knowing some of the Pictish customs, Lyr demanded, Swear it on your name." The shaman, amused that Lyr knew the ritual, turned and declared to his Picts, "This boy is a shaman. I take him for my slave, as is the right of those who conquer. Clearly Geel Hungry Crow called to us to find him, that he might join our tribe and be a shaman in turn. I swear by my name, Hochganuk, that this is so. Do any say I lie?" Amongst the Picts none spoke, none challenged. "To appease the spirits, I declare, the children you have taken, who have not yet been claimed as sons or daughters, release them into the wild. The spirits have a place for them amongst the trees to die or thrive. But the women you have taken, make them fat with new children for our tribe," Hochganuk declared. To this there was some minor muttering of disapproval, but since the warriors were allowed to keep the women as booty, it was not overmuch. "You, warriors," Hochganuk pointed to 2 warriors, "take Notahi from the post, and bring him to the huts of my wives. There see to his wounds. Tomorrow we begin his education as a Pict." 2 burly but short men cut Lyr free of the post. They approached him carefully and handled him with dread, for the heart wound that should have slain him was now nothing but a bit of ugly scar tissue. The miraculous healing terrified them, and in his mind Lyr vowed to use that superstitious terror to his full advantage. The Picts carried him to a rough tent made of skins that had been thrown around a wooden frame. In its dim and smoky obscured light they laid him upon a pelt. "Sleep, Notahi," they bid him. Yet sleep did not come. Only rage, impotent due to circumstance but no less fierce, burned within Lyr's chest. Other men might have given thought to the marvels they had witnessed, but Lyr did not know if he could trust the visions he had seen while dying. He might simply have imagined the visitation of the goddesses of that dreadful place, yet he also could not explain how his wounds had healed. By what name were the trio of goddesses called? He searched his memory and recalled only a legend about the 3 wives of Crom. If he had truly been aided by goddesses, he worried what may await him in the future. For gods and goddesses did not give their favor lightly, and it was almost always to the detriment of the hero that they favored that their aims were furthered. This seemed to match the predicament that Lyr found himself in. He had pledged his service to a hated enemy. In that service he had accepted the Pictish dictum that he himself could not slay nor curse Hochganuk save in a duel. The wily shaman would surely never accept such a duel. Lyr was trapped. He lay still and watched the Picts continue their celebration, and plotted all the while how he could arrange for a Pictish warrior to slay the sorcerer that held them all captive.